Under fire, Brazil's president deploys the army to contain devastating blazes in the Amazon. That's come as criticism from the outside is growing, along with demands to save the so-called lungs of the world. But what's triggered this natural disaster, and why has it turned political? This is Inside Story. Hello there, a very warm welcome to the programme. I'm Julie MacDonald. The green lungs of our planet are burning. Fires across Brazil's Amazon are wiping out huge areas of rainforest. They're burning out of control in many parts at a record rate. And official figures show there's been more than 75,000 forest fires in Brazil, and that's just this year alone. If they can't be stopped, then we may be in very real trouble. And that's because the Amazon forest absorbs millions of tons of carbon emissions every single year, and they're crucial in regulating global warming. Well, this satellite map shows all the fires that have been burning in the Amazon. And the crisis has created a panic amongst environmentalists and even some governments around the globe. Many are blaming Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro, for not doing enough to stop the blazes. Daniel Schweimler reports from the state of Rondônia. That's one of the worst affected regions.
Forest fires happen every year in Brazil, but it was the sheer scale this year that shocked the world. The so-called world's lungs were on fire. Strong criticism firstly from within Brazil, then the rest of the world, forced President Jair Bolsonaro to respond.
Isso não pode servir de pretexto.
Forest fires happen all over the world, so this is no reason to impose international sanctions. Brazil will continue to be, as it is now, a country that is friendly with everyone and is responsible in protecting its Amazon forest.
But he's been accused by many of creating the very conditions he is now trying to control. But there's a defiance from the president and resentment from his supporters at other countries telling Brazil what to do.
I don't agree that other countries should come here to Brazil. We don't go to other countries to upset them. You don't see Brazilians there causing problems, only working to send money home to invest here.
This is pioneering country, distant from Brazil's main population centres. Bolsonaro had a message that resonated here.
I'm 63 years old and I've never seen a president as honest as this one, who confronts the problems and says what has to be said. He is defending Brazil.
These are people who came to tame the forest, to cut and burn, to carve a future from what they consider to be a wilderness. This particular blaze may not be huge, but it's one of tens of thousands burning across Brazil. Some controlled, some not, some illegal, some legal. What's clear is that few will be investigated, but the consequences will eventually be felt around the world. The fires are being put out, but what's left is this, blackened devastation, which will take many years to recover. 70% of the state of Rondônia has already been developed, deforested for lucrative timber, then burned to create land for cattle rearing and soya production. The rest is up for grabs, and no one, it seems, is stopping them.
At the moment, if you burn the forest, you are backed up by your president, and then you do it exactly as you want to do because you know nothing will happen. And that's a problem, and we have seen statistically when there's law enforcement, fires and deforestation goes down. When we don't have it, it goes up.
The fires are still burning, but will Bolsonaro bend under the heat of international pressure or bow to the ambitions of some of his strongest supporters? Daniel Schweimler, Jazeera, Rondônia State, northwestern Brazil.
So let's bring in our guests. From Washington, D.C., Andrew Miller is Advocacy Director at Amazon Watch. In Sao Paulo, via Skype, Simone Rosito is a businesswoman, philanthropist and political commentator. And in Bristol, Farnon Ellwood is a community ecologist and professor of conservation science at the University of the West of England in Bristol. A very warm welcome to you all. This is a massive subject, isn't it? It's interconnected, the local and global in so many ways. Simone, I want to start with you. What's it been like to be inside Brazil, having conversations with your friends and the wider community and seeing this story develop into something much bigger?
Well, Julie, it all started on Monday afternoon when São Paulo went really dark, which, okay, we are at winter time, but it's very unusual to have, dark skies at 3 p.m. And later on that day, it turned out that the reason why we had that unusual weather was because of the fires in the Amazon. And that's what kicked off the subject. And it really has taken over the whole country over the past few days, with people in the north of Brazil saying that it's always been like that for them this time of the year, and that for a change, now you had the whole country talking about it. But it really kicked off the conversation to start.
Andrew, I can see you nodding vigorously there. The Amazon rainforest right now is being described as being under assault. This is the kind of phraseology that we're hearing. Under assault specifically by Bolsonaro, Brazil's leader. Is that fair?
The Amazon is absolutely under assault in terms of the policies that Bolsonaro is carrying out and, of course, the rhetoric that we're seeing. And obviously, to clarify, it didn't start with Bolsonaro. There were tendencies in the previous administration, even before then. But the assault has been really accelerated under Bolsonaro, even going back to before he was elected, the discourse that he had, not one more centimeter of lands to be titled to indigenous peoples, really supporting many of the economic interests, the loggers, the miners, and of course, the very powerful ruralistas. And then now, as president, implementing or trying to implement many different policies in terms of lack of enforcement of the existing norms and laws in Brazil, many of which are very strong. And as I think was mentioned earlier before the program now, when those laws are enforced, it has a huge impact and can really put down the deforestation. But those laws are not being enforced. There's a direct effort to weaken those laws before the Brazilian Congress. And of course, many of the ministers that have been installed by Bolsonaro are climate deniers, or the Minister of Environment, who's essentially an environmental criminal. So in many ways, the policies have been quite horrific. And of course, the discourse, very anti-indigenous discourse, talking about the deforestation numbers that have been coming out, the spike in deforestation, those numbers as being fake news. Of course, firing the head of the Brazilian Space Agency, and then most recently blaming NGOs for having started the fires. So I think we can definitely describe this as an assault on the Amazon.
Farnon, listening to this being described in more political terms, from your perspective as a conservationist who, of course, is involved in repopulating diversity in lots of areas of former rainforests across the globe, how serious is this from your perspective, something that you have long been involved in?
Well, unfortunately, the truth is that this is legitimately an ecological catastrophe. The fact is that the world's rainforests, and when people describe them as the lungs of the planet, they are not the lungs of Brazil, they are not the lungs of South America, the rainforests of Southeast Asia are not the lungs of Southeast Asia, they are the lungs of the planet. Every single person on this planet is going to suffer if they cut down the rainforests, which are purifying the air and the water in those countries. So basically, it makes me very unhappy because we work in Southeast Asia, but the tropical rainforests, the main locations are Southeast Asia and Africa and the Amazon, and they each have different problems. But the immediate problem in the Amazon are these fires which are burning out of control. And this is something which is coming to our news cameras. It's why we're talking about it now, which is a very good thing. But the Amazon rainforest has been dying slowly for a very long time, but almost out of sight and out of mind. These fires that are happening now, and the blackout in Sao Paulo, and the smog, and these apocalyptic images that we're now seeing, it's almost some kind of biblical apocalypse. This is now bringing it much more into real time. This is happening now, today, and it will happen tomorrow and the next day. And these rainforests cannot be replaced. Once they are gone, they are gone.
Farnon raises an interesting point, Simone. Who does the Amazon belong to? You know, we hear from Bolsonaro saying, you know, it's not your house on fire, it's our house on fire. We heard it in Daniel Schweimler's piece. He was talking to one of the farmers who said, you know, we don't go around interfering in other people's business. Why are other people interfering here? So who does the Amazon belong to? And is there a feeling in Brazil that actually there are other countries poking in their noses?
Julie, last night Bolsonaro came on TV to talk, supposedly he was going to talk about what measures were going to be taken, to control the fires. But at the end, he didn't announce anything new. He just said that the armed forces were going to be sent there, but that was already known. And he kept on talking about the threat of economic sanctions. And that's the first we heard of it. He says the Amazon fire cannot be an excuse for economic sanctions against Brazil. When he was talking on TV, there were people banging pots and pans, just like they used to do during the Dilma Rousseff government when she was about to be impeached, just, as a way of showing their disapproval against the president. And the fact is, I think Brazilians, first of all, yes, the Amazon belongs to Brazil, but it is a global issue. If Brazil cannot control the fires, it is important for the world to know it. Also, the other thing that's being talked about here is how there are fires in the Bolivian Amazon as well. So that should be borne in mind as well. So yes, we feel that the Amazon is ours, but it is a global issue. So definitely has to be brought up, by all the interested parties, basically.
Andrew, there's a lot of talk right now about halting trade deals. Simone, you mentioned that there are potential sanctions, finding ways with the stick rather than the carrot to, bring Brazil into line. But I wondered, do we need a different sort of policy? Do we need something more enlightened, figuring out how to best take care of the Amazon and finding a way to encourage whichever Brazilian government it is, or whichever government anywhere that is a caretaker of one of these spaces, to do it in a way, I don't know if we have to find a way to pay that country to be that caretaker, but is there some sort of middle ground that isn't about this kind of old world of sanctions and hitting people with a great big stick?
Well, that's a great question. In response to the last question about who does the Amazon belong to, in part, the Amazon belongs to the original people that live there, the Brazilian and the indigenous peoples. In many ways, it's their ancestral territories. They've lived there since long before the Brazilian state existed. And they're the ones who are the best defenders of the Amazon. And in terms of the assault that we were talking about earlier, the people who are most feeling that assault are indigenous peoples. And they're working very hard to defend their territories, to protect the Amazon, to defend the global climate, but are receiving death threats. There are people trying to invade their lands, loggers, miners, and the indigenous peoples are confronting them. So it's very important in all of these conversations, we're not just talking about the Brazilian state versus what the French are saying and what other governments are saying. The indigenous peoples need to be central, and their voices and their demands really need to lead the responses. In terms of the free trade agreements and sanctions and all these other conversations, I mean, that's very important, in part because the Amazon is being cut down in order to create agriculture land, in order to create pastures for cattle, much of which is being exported to markets in Europe and in other places. And so it's very important to understand the global economics of all this, not just the climate implications, but actually what our complicity is. When I say our, as here in the United States, of course, is a market for many of these products, many of the corporations that are the commodity traders that are involved in distributing these products are humongous companies like Cargill, Archer Daniels Midland. Some of the largest private banks in the world are heavily invested in these industries, Bank of America, Citibank, among others, and enormous investment funds like BlackRock. And so it's really important to understand also who are some of the economic actors that are benefiting ultimately from the deforestation that's going on, the assault on the Amazon. And yes, I think the free trade agreements, I don't know if not signing a free trade agreement can be considered a sanction, but we need to be very careful about that. And I think it is important in the conversations around Europe. Also here in the United States, after Bolsonaro came and visited with Donald Trump in March, there's been some conversations as of late in recent weeks about the idea of a U.S.-Brazil free trade agreement. And personally, I think that's incredibly problematic, especially in this context, and especially given the vision that Bolsonaro has for the Amazon. I don't think the United States should be involved in that vision.
Farnon, you were nodding vigorously at the mention, of course, of the people that you come into contact with and work with a lot, the indigenous peoples who protect their lands, who understand the patterns of the ecology and the nature and how important it is. And then you've got someone like me who had, soya milk in their coffee this morning, and I have that every morning, and I have hardwood furniture, and to some degree I am a consumer, like many of us are, responsible partly for what's happening in the Amazon. But I wonder, how do we focus people on this idea that we're all complicit when it feels like at a personal level it's very hard to do anything when these big corporations and banks and hedge funds are involved so much further up the chain? So Farnon, what can we do to focus people?
Well, I think this is the kind of heart of the matter. We're talking about the rainforest, which is a natural phenomenon. Now, the natural world is created by two forces. There are ecological forces, which are the day-to-day forces. When plants and animals wake up, they decide what to eat, with whom to mate, how to pass on their genes. There are also evolutionary forces, the balance of nature. As animals and plants interact through millennia, through millions of years, they produce the rainforest. Now the humans, the indigenous peoples that live within the rainforest, that evolved within the rainforest and spend every day of their lives in the rainforest, are of course in the best position to be able to protect it. But as we have seen, the market forces, global economies have now completely stripped them of any power. The power lies, as your other guest was just saying, in the hands of the hedge fund managers, the markets. But what is beginning to happen, I hope that these images, I hope that what's happening with the politicians at the G7 summit this very weekend, it's coming to the public attention of people like you and me who put soya milk in our coffee, or maybe buy hardwood furniture, or eat beef burgers. It's beginning to sort of dawn on people. And here at the United Kingdom, this summer, we've had a lot of protests, a lot of climate change protests. And of course, rainforests are linked to climate change because they remove CO2 from the atmosphere. It will take each and every single one of us to rise up. It cannot be left in the hands of the Rainforest Alliance, of Greenpeace. And I've seen social media, I've seen Instagram tweets of people saying that their prayers are with the Amazon. The Amazon needs more than prayers. People must stop using hardwood furniture. They must stop consuming as much beef. The free trade agreements concerning beef are in the hands of us because we elect the politicians. And the reason why politicians are becoming Emmanuel Macron, Boris Johnson, the new British Prime Minister, I can tell you that the reason why it is now on his agenda is because he wants to be voted in again. And it's in the hands of the people. If we can apply pressure on our politicians, they will begin to respond. And if it takes the removal of a free trade deal, if Brazilians and other countries, it's the same with oil palm in Southeast Asia. If countries are cutting down rainforest to make products to export to the West, and that is destroying rainforest and increasing climate change, if those of us in the West who vote in our politicians stop the consumption, the free trade agreements will have to stop. It is supply and demand. If we remove the demand, they must stop the supply.
Simone, on that note, do the people of Brazil, including the indigenous peoples, many of which are going to be joining marches over the coming days, do they feel powerful right now? Do they feel listened to?
Oh, yes, finally. Bolsonaro was elected last year pretty much because of a big polarization in the country. People were fed up with the Workers' Party corruption over the past 16 years. Bolsonaro, who was formerly a congressman, who in 30 years didn't present any project of relevance, he encountered, his voice was heard by these people tired of corruption, and that's why he got elected. And finally, with this issue of the fires in Amazon, this is finally uniting the country, because you begin to see people from different political spheres, joining together on that. So in a way, I think that's really good, and I think the locals are feeling quite powerful with that regards. And on that note, I have to say that I totally agree with the two previous guests and what they said. It's well, not sanctions, but if you do control the demand side of things, that gives us all worldwide some power, over the Amazon issue.
And I'm wondering, Andrew, where is the biggest leverage? I mean, there are other voices in the region. The Colombian president has been talking about moving away from short-termism and into reforestation, which I know will be music to your ears, Farnon. So which are the actors, within Central and South America that can influence this dialogue? And what about the rest of the globe? And what tone does that conversation need to take?
Well, I mean, obviously, a tone of urgency is super important, but also, I mean, really looking at concrete solutions. I think you'd mentioned earlier kind of what role should other governments and other actors play. Unfortunately, there have been some attempts to provide support from other actors. You have an Amazon fund, which received significant funding from the Norwegians and from the German government as sort of a model for, potential model for cooperation, for support for projects in the Amazon. But recently those countries essentially withdrew, in part because of tensions with the Bolsonaro administration. The new administration wanted to change the structure of the project, and the decision-making essentially wants to centralize the decision-making with themselves. So there have been expressions of will to support the Brazilian government in different kinds of projects, but from the exterior, but that, the government itself really needs to be willing to support those projects. There are a lot of great existing ministries or entities within Brazil. The IBAMA, which is the environmental police, who are really the people who should be going out and working to end any sort of illegal operations around the country. So, I guess international governments should support the existing structures in Brazil, the people in Brazil, within the Brazilian government who are really trying to do the right thing. But in recent years, their power and their budgets have been significantly cut. But yes, I do believe the role of other governments in the region is important, in part because the Amazon, of course, exists in 9 countries. 2/3 of that is in Brazil, but the rest are in 9 other countries, significant portions in Bolivia, in Peru, in Colombia, places where there are also fires, as was mentioned. So a high level of cooperation among, Amazonian countries is very important. We haven't talked at all about China and other companies that are also markets for some of the products. So, those countries need to play a role too. We can't just talk about Europe and talk about the United States. We need to talk about other emerging markets that are having a huge effect on what's happening in the Amazon, what's going on in Brazil and elsewhere. So I think it's really a question about political will in many places. And hopefully these images going around the world, hopefully the protests that we're seeing across Brazil, across the world really, this weekend and this coming month, there are going to be many protests, including potentially more actions around the Amazon, and of course the climate strikes that are happening later on. The September 20th is the youth climate strike. Right around that time, the UN is coming together in New York City. That would be a good opportunity for global leaders to talk about these issues. I mean, Bolsonaro apparently is going to go to try and make an address at the United Nations, which is going to probably be very controversial in the current context. So there definitely are fora to do this. The question is, does the political will exist to really have these conversations? The grassroots uprising that we're seeing is very encouraging. The fact that we have a lot of authoritarian governments like Bolsonaro, like our own government here, Trump and others, is very discouraging because those folks are not likely to want to listen to those kinds of grassroots voices.
So it sounds to me, everybody, like it's up to all of us. A huge thank you to all of our guests today. I know it's an enormous subject which we could talk about for a long time and more. Thank you so much for joining us. Andrew Miller, Simone, Rosito and Farnon, Ellwood. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. So for me, Julie MacDonald, and the whole team here, it's a great bye-bye for now. And as always, Thanks for watching and for your company. Bye-bye.